Awesome. Thanks so much for getting us started, and good morning, everybody. We're so excited to be presenting at the SEAHO virtual conference. I know personally this is my first SEAHO, so really excited to be joining you all today for what makes a good RA, using data to tell the story. And there it goes. It doesn't want to click. There we go. See, I told you I'd mess something up first. My name is Matt Venaas. I use he, him, his pronouns. Despite what the program book says, I actually work for SkyFactor, not eRezLife. For SkyFactor is a Macmillan learning company, and folks may know us as EBI, but I'm a research manager on our analytics and research team. And I'm going to let my fabulous colleagues introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cate Morrison. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I work at eRezLife Software. And I'll turn it over to Steve from there.
Good morning, SEAHO. My name is Steve Syoen. I'm an Assistant Director of Residence Life at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. It's good to see everyone this morning.
Awesome. So to get us started, just high-level plan for where we're going to go today. We're going to start with a little bit of context at the beginning and then dive into the data portion of the conversation and highlight 7 key insights from some national data on the student staff experience. We'll talk a little bit about implications for that in terms of high-level themes, hiring good RAs. Steve's going to talk about data in action at Tennessee Knoxville and what it looks like to take data and use it to inform your efforts for RAs. And then we'll do some wrap-up items and moving forward. But first, for a little context, we know folks may not be familiar with some of the places we sit. So Cate and I thought it would be good just to give a quick introduction to kind of who we are outside of the direct campus context.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So eRezLife is a all-inclusive software solution. So we offer software that can help you track and analyze your data. So we work in the realms of residence life, housing assignments, staff selection and hiring, facilities, and then we have a consulting branch as well. Beyond that, you'll kind of see today how we function a little bit in the staff hiring side of things, but we also have a big focus on community, as you might have heard in the business meeting, and making those relationships more functional in terms of creating a community of practice. So that's kind of the high level overview of eRezLife, but we'd love to see you later at the exhibits fair. So pop by and say hi.
Doesn't want to click. There we go. And then I work for SkyFactor on our analytics and research team. We're a Macmillan learning company. A lot of higher ed, especially housing, knows us as EBI. Housing is our biggest area for national benchmarking assessments. So if you've ever heard of the resident assessment, or some folks call it the EBI still, that's us. We do benchmarking surveys. Housing is our big area, but we do others in student affairs, academic disciplines. We've been around for about 20 years. So surveys, reporting, data funness. So just some opening context of who we are there. So thinking through the framework for today's conversation, we're all big believers in using data to inform our practice, to figure out opportunities for improvement, and to really use it to improve the experiences of our on-campus residents. So we really wanted to take that framework and apply it to this topic of housing student staff and use it to have a really engaging and informing conversation so that we can think through ways that we can really use data to inform our practice and our efforts. So in that vein, we're going to talk high level about 7 key insights from 2 of the national data sets that we have at SkyFactor. One is the Akuhoi Benchworks resident assessment, the one I joke that if you hear folks say we do the EBI survey, that's most likely what they're talking about. But we're also going to pull in some insights from our student staff assessment, so the survey that campuses send to student staff about their experience. We're going to be looking at data from the 2018-19 academic year. So for the resident assessment, about 250 institutions, 250,000 responses. For this context, it's just the US respondents. We do some other countries as well. Student staff, it's about 3,400 student staff members, 40 institutions. It's the one academic year, but the themes and trends and insights have been reflective of what we've seen in both data sets over past 5+ years. For context, most do it online, but some do paper survey, and it's a pretty diverse range of institutions in terms of size, mission, location, timing of the year they do it. And again, we're showing national data. So if you're on a campus that uses one of these assessments, that your individual results may look a little different. That's okay. So little context there. So we're going to start with some high-level insights from the resident assessment. So perspective from on-campus residents of their RA. And I think the first insight that's really important to point out is that by and large, residents are extremely satisfied with their RA. This first slide, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into some of the structure and context and language because we'll use it in the following slides. So I want to make sure that we're being accessible and folks are comfortable with the way we're going to talk about things. So what you're looking at on the left-hand side are 7 of the questions that residents answer about their student staff members. So do they treat everyone fairly, promote tolerance, are they available, those sorts of things. The percentage is those who answered 6 or 7 on the 7-point scale, 7 being highly satisfied or the positive end of the scale and 1 being the negative. So in this case, 79% of residents said, like on the extreme end, that their RA treated everyone fairly, so on and so forth. And these questions are part of what we call the student staff satisfaction factor. A factor is a group of survey questions around a similar topic. And what we do is, so in this case, 67% of on-campus residents scored high on that factor. And when we say score high on the factor overall, it's a 1 to 7 scale. So we just do a mean score for everybody's, each person's responses across that factor. And 67% averaged at least a 6 on the 7-point scale across all of the questions. So representing how we describe those highly satisfied with student staff. So that seems like a pretty big number, but I wanted to also put it into context because when you look at the percent of students who score high across all of the satisfaction factors on the resident assessment, that student staff one's at the top. So even within the context of other things in the resident assessment, your on-campus residents are more likely to say that they're highly satisfied with their RA than they are to say that they're satisfied with almost anything else in the resident assessment, roommates, hall environment, programming, those sorts of things. So context there that it's important to set out from the get-go that residents are really satisfied by and large with their RAs. Second, I think, is to start to dive into some of the data pieces and look at what relates to high satisfaction with RAs. And while we're trying to get away, I think, from a culture and housing of thinking as RAs as just students who put on programs in their floors, that we need to acknowledge in the national data, there is a really strong relationship between satisfaction with RAs and the degree to which residents are satisfied with programming. When we look at national data, it's important for context that about 13% of residents say that they attend programs often or very often, with about 1 in 5 saying they never go. But when we look at those 5 groups and see how related, how satisfied they are with their RA, there's that linear trend there. So the more often residents go to programs, the more likely they are to say they're highly satisfied with their RA. But we know that relationships, it's more just beyond the high level correlation. So what we did behind the scenes was run a regression analysis with that satisfaction with RA factor as the dependent variable and looked at the degree to which we could predict that based on other factors in the assessment. And the satisfaction with programming was the top predictor nationally. So not just that they're related in terms of a positive or strong correlation, but that we could attribute variation in that score to that programming satisfaction factor more so than we could others. So when we think of residents, they do definitely relate their RAs pretty strongly with programming. That having been said, it was not the top predictor by much. And residents do clearly recognize as we move into our third point that RAs are much more than programming, that they really recognize the breadth of their efforts. So what we did was we looked at for the other top predictors of RA satisfaction, we see things like the degree to which residents say their experience contributed to learning outcomes around diverse interactions, personal interactions, sense of community, the degree to which residents say they feel safe in their building. So what this is showing is the orange dot is the percent of all residents who scored high on those particular factors. And then the green dot is the group that were highly satisfied with their RA. So there is the relationship that if residents are highly satisfied with their RA, they're more likely to say that their housing experience contributed to a wide range of learning outcomes. They're more likely to be satisfied with their hall environment. They're more likely to feel safe in their residence hall. So it goes to show the breadth of that recognition of residents and the efforts their RAs are putting into that broader experience. There also is a piece as well that residents were more likely to report a positive experience the more they interacted with their RA. We added a few new questions over the past few years, and one of those was asking how often residents interact with their RA or their student staff member in a typical week. And while 31% said that they don't interact with their RA in a typical week, you get about 7 out of 10 who do, including about 25% who say they interact with their RA at least 3 times in a typical week. So just to provide some context of how often residents say they typically interact with their RA. And then when we take those groups and look at how they score on other factors to represent that, the more often residents say they interact with their RA, the more likely they are to be highly satisfied with their RA, and they're also more likely just to report a broader overall housing experience satisfaction. So definitely a pretty strong relationship between how often residents interact with their RA and their broader housing experience perceptions. So we've done some high-level trends for national data from the perspective of the resident, but we also wanted to look at the student staff experience from the RAs themselves. So the final 3 insights are looking at data from that student staff assessment. So the first piece I think is important is we looked at the top predictors of student staff member satisfaction with their own experience to get a sense of what different factors of their experience play into their satisfaction as an RA. And to no surprise for anybody who's ever had a job, the top predictor was satisfaction with compensation and job demands. Intuitive to think that for folks to have a good experience in a job, that the job requirements need to be fair, we need to compensate them fairly. That's fairly intuitive, but it's what we saw in the data. So another similar chart with the 2 dots. So the orange is the percent of all RAs who were satisfied with these different pieces. So 48% of all RAs were satisfied with how they were able to balance their academics with their job, 45% constraints on leaving campus, so on and so forth. The green is where the RAs who said that they had a good overall experience, how they scored on those questions. So residents or student staff, excuse me, who had a good overall experience as a student staff member were more likely to say that their student staff experience, that they were satisfied with the privacy of their room, their accommodations, how they were paid, the number of hours they worked. So a strong relationship between how they perceived their overall experience and how they were treated and what was expected of them in that job. But one of the other things that was really striking when we look at the top predictors of overall satisfaction with the RA experience is that from the perspective of the RA, a good experience was one that they learned from. So when we look at the different learning outcome factors on the student staff assessment, that RAs who rated their overall experience highly were more likely to indicate that they learned from that experience. So while 76% of all student staff members indicated that their experience contributed to learning outcomes around diverse interactions, for those who were highly satisfied with their overall experience, that number was over 90%. And we see that trend similarly when we look at the other learning outcomes on the assessment, things like the degree to which it helped contribute to learning around empathy, personal and practical competencies, self-knowledge, a lot of those transferable skills that our student staff can take and utilize and leverage in their academic experience, in their full-time employment once they graduate, those skills that we want our student staff members to have once they leave our residence halls. So our RAs recognize that a good experience is one that they learn from and that they can take that knowledge and apply it elsewhere.
Hey, Matt.
Yeah.
Before you get any further with the RA, we had a question in the chat that I figure might be more relevant to take now. Was student population, in parentheses, upper class versus first year, or building type taken into consideration? I think this was maybe 2 slides ago, but I don't know if in general you can kind of answer that for the data.
The numbers we're presenting here are just looking at high level nationally. When we did the analysis, we did look deeper at things like campus type, campus size. I do believe that, I don't have it in here, I know the first year RAs do tend to score higher on some of these satisfaction and learning outcome pieces than returning staff. So that piece is there, but it's the general trends are still similar, but for returners, their scores on some of those learning outcomes are a little bit lower than for first year RAs, but not anything that I think from a practical standpoint I would call drastic, but something good to keep in mind as we think about ways that we want to inform our efforts around making sure our returning RAs are having a good experience. So great question. Thank you for sending that in.
Yeah, and Savannah, if that didn't answer it exactly, I'm sure I'm going to go ahead and extend Matt's services ahead of time. We can probably hang out afterwards and answer more specifically if that didn't cover it. So.
Absolutely. And I'm going to wrap up here in the moment, and then I'm going to be in the chat for the rest of the conversation. So I'm happy to go back and forth about some more of the details. The final insight is looking at and recognizing that for RAs, a good experience meant being surrounded by other good RAs. So one of the things that I found striking in looking at what the top predictors of student staff members' satisfaction with their experience was that the satisfaction with other members of their team was a stronger predictor than the factors around supervising and supervisor relationships. So the percentages here are the percent of all RAs who said that their experience in terms of the other student staff members on their team, that they respected each other, worked well together, communicated well with each other, the things that we would want and expect from a student staff team. So it's an interesting thing to think about that from the perspective of the RA, this importance of being surrounded by other good RAs and the way that that kind of feeds into the experience. So those are our 7 key insights and some of the things we see in the national data. Obviously, it's not everything. And for the purposes of the conversation today, we did keep it pretty high level. We didn't get into slicing and dicing in terms of first year versus returners or some other pieces that may play in. But we wanted to kind of highlight these trends to give a sense of what we see in the national data, that recognizing from the fact that our RAs are generally have good experiences with their experience, that our residents are highly satisfied. The residents recognize the breadth of the efforts that their student staff members put into their floors and their areas. And then looking at some of the things that play into, from the student staff perspective, having a quality experience. So as I wrap up here, I'll be in the chat for the rest of the time. So I'd love to hear from folks if there was anything here that surprised you, if this is similar or different to what you see on your campus, talking about some of the data you have on the experiences of your RAs. I'll be in the chat, so please feel free to chime in questions and I will get to those as quickly as I can. But at this point, I think it's important to take this data, put it into context about what it practically means for how we think about build a good RA experience, how we work with our RAs. So to start with that conversation, I'm going to pass it over to Cate to talk a little bit about some high-level themes and put a bit more of a practitioner perspective on these trends. Cate?
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. So as Matt said, and as everyone in this room knows, RAs are much more than programmers, and we've definitely seen that this year. So 4 themes that we saw emerge when we looked more closely at the data were that 4 kind of traits emerged of the good RAs. So 1, the sense of accountability; 2, consistency in action; 3, ability to connect to others; and 4, a desire to improve. So I'm sure when you look at these traits, none of them are surprising to you. I'm sure if we sat in a roundtable discussion with no prompts, you all would say these things regardless. But what we're here today to encourage you to do is to actually identify these and think about how they work into your strategic goals and your programming and your learning outcomes and all of those things that you identify for your staff members. So if you look at the life cycle of an RA, it's important to consider all of the pieces and how these align. So thinking about recruitment, how will you use this information? And that kind of thing. So Matt, we've lost the slides.
Yep, that was me. Give me just a second. I'm
As
sorry.
long as we're okay with, no, it's all good. So we want to look at recruitment, selection, training, and we'll get to those in a little bit. We also want to look at management, which is something that Steve's going to talk more about, but how does your institution support ongoing training and foster these traits in your staff members? Equally, we're going to look at evaluations, and again, Steve will touch in this much more depth than I can, but how do we find the balance of personal growth plus achieving your overall goals as an institution, and valuing those things in your top tier RAs, and also fostering those qualities in the RAs that need it. And then obviously we want to take a look at assessment and how does that manifest and what do we do there, especially in a more socially distanced role. There's certain things that would be much more difficult. So how do you look at the ability to connect to others in a socially distanced role? So with that kind of context, I'm going to pass it over to Steve, and I'll come back a little bit later to touch upon a couple more things.
Thanks, Cate. So excited to be here with eRezLife and SkyFactor, both companies that we work with here at Tennessee Knoxville. And I've not worked at a ton of institutions, but I will say the investment in taking the data and really owning it and using it to create meaningful data-driven change at Tennessee has been one of the things that's been probably the most exciting thing for me to learn in my time here as an assistant director. So I kind of want to briefly go over how we use the data from both of the customer or client software providers as their client, and then talk a little bit about how we use specific data to kind of drive the performance or the desire to improve with our hall staff. So as far as SkyFactor goes, we are one of the campuses that Matt references that still does paper surveys. This year, because of COVID, we didn't, and I think we probably all experienced some sort of a drop in our participation rates. But when you go from the high 80% participation rate when you do it all in person to our numbers this year, it was a drastic difference. And so we are one of the paper institutions. The Residence Life leadership team, which is our associate director and 3 assistant directors for Residence Life, take the scores every year, and we look at specific services. A lot of times we're looking at the data outside of our department. And so we do assess on the dining experience, and then housekeeping and maintenance. And while housekeeping is in our department, maintenance is not. We have liaisons to our university facility services team. So those scores get sent over to those folks, or at least to our liaisons in our departments, to be able to pass that information along to give them an idea of how they're doing according to our students that take the survey. And to no surprise, I'm pretty sure the lowest score we've had continually has been dining services. So I think nationally they try, but it's a real hard uphill battle to win the affection of your students there. And then after we've had a chance to review the information, we pass it along to our hall staff, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what they do with it. But we do ask them to make a plan for their building. And our hall staff, when I say that, I mean our full-time hall director and our graduate assistants serving as assistant hall directors. eRezLife, our data pool is a lot of our reporting. And so our annual reports come every year for Cleary, Title IX, and then our own departmental report for our division. Program review, we went through an external program review in 2018, and the amount of data that we had to pull for the reviewers beforehand was so easy when you have a software that kind of keeps it all in one place and makes reporting easy. Unique circumstances and requests. COVID-19, I think we always get the parent or the guardian that'll call and say, my child says there's nothing to do on campus. And we all know that that's maybe not necessarily true. It's what they're choosing to attend or participate in. But with COVID-19, we've had to run program reports on what is the volume of virtual programming we're offering to our students, sometimes in general, but then also to our students in isolation and quarantine housing specifically. And then that local news article happens and you get a request. And so one of the things I can remember is something will happen and it'll be an alcohol incident on campus that was pretty public. And then people are saying like, well, what alcohol efforts are being done in the halls? And so the ability to run reports on our programming efforts and our community development efforts to be able to answer that question is really helpful. And then justifying expenses or resources. A lot of campuses, when COVID hit, they closed down. Some of the RAs were just kind of told like, thanks for your service, but we're kind of everyone's going home and you won't be needed anymore. Our campus had a commitment to maintaining our staff. And we were able to show, even after the fact, that keeping them on staff was worth it because we had programming data to show what we were still doing to connect with all of our residents as they had to go home and readapt in the middle of the semester and things like that. And then software, when you're able to run reports and really provide rich data, it's easy to justify the cost of a service or an assessment tool that you continue to buy every year in your budget cycle. And then ultimately we combine these two to assess the overall breadth and depth of what we're doing. And so for us with the eRezLife, a lot of that's our community development model work. And then ultimately the Sky Factor survey is us assessing our mission, vision, values, and services ultimately at the end of the day. So we use both of them in conjunction sometimes, but it really helps us to be able to paint a picture of the good work we're doing in our department. Matt, you can move us to our next slide. Satisfaction, this is something that we're extremely proud of. We know some institutions that would love to get, their scores to be just over a 6. We have a lot of our scores at Tennessee that are over a 6, and we're always trying to get them closer to 7, but the higher you get to the top, the harder it is to move the needle. But just to give you an idea of where our students are with our RAs from 2010 to 2019, you see here that the lowest we've ever reported was a 6.17, which is still pretty good on a 7-point scale. And then our 2019 data was 6.42. And I, like many of you in the chat, I'm interested to see how our results come back when we're looking at COVID times versus not. Now we can move forward. Oh, sorry, go back. Too quick. All right, so how do you promote ownership of the data amongst a eRezLife staff? First thing we do is that we do typically review the annual report from Sky Factor with our full-time hall director and graduate assistant hall director during training each year. This year, part of the things of you can't do everything in a time of a global pandemic, this had to take a back burner, but the 5 years before it that I've been here, this is an annual reoccurrence. We then have the hall director and assistant hall director go look at the last 3 or 4 years of their scores, where they scored, and then present a plan. And that plan is presented to the eRezLife staff, but we invite our associate director for housing services, administrative services, our executive director, to come and listen, because all of the Sky Factor data points come from different areas of our department. And so in some cases, usually either the extreme high end of our scores or possibly the lower end of our scores, we then have the hall director can share a score with a third-year returner and be like, your satisfaction, your first year was a 6 point something, your satisfaction last year was a 5 point something. What changed in your world? What changed in your community? Why did that score drop so significantly? And if they were in a first-year building as a first-year RA and maybe an upper division hall the second year, that may explain it just because of the nature of the interactions changing. But oftentimes these RAs don't get any less busy the longer they serve our department. And so that kind of helps us reflect with them. Is this really something that you're able to continue to dedicate the time to if it comes down to a matter of them being stretched too thin? So I talked about doing the hall director, and then we kind of take the data down to the RAs. And so where does that come in? Comes in through RA training. If we see certain areas on our Sky Factor survey, or if we're seeing certain types of programs in our eRezLife data that aren't getting, good attendance rates or things like that, we can then implement that into training to talk about what our trends are with that and what our students are reacting to, responding to positively, negatively, less enthusiastically, whatever the case may be. We do have a Hall of Fame here at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. We can induct up to 5 RAs annually. And part of that is what's their EBI score? Because if they do really great things for the staff, but they're not really a great RA for the student, is that really who we want represented in our Hall of Fame for doing the best of the best for service to Tennessee? Our associate director will often tell us, like, it's great if they're a great colleague, but are they being a good RA? Because sometimes the RA's favorite part of their job is their staff, whereas I really want their favorite part of the job to be being on the floor with their students, because that's what we hired them for. And then rehiring the returning RA process. If you have an RA that has a low EBI score, you can put time and effort and training into that to see specifically like what areas impacted the overall score to try and coach them. But ultimately, when we look at our returning RAs, if you have an RA that's repeatedly scored poorly. There are things that you can control outside, factors outside of the control of the RA that can control for a little bit of it. But ultimately, when we have an overall satisfaction score for RAs at 6.4, if someone's really scoring that low, there's something going on there. And so we do use that in the rehiring and returning RA process discussions. So using data with RAs as the employee, we do have them fill out the student staff survey, and we do have the hall staff, the head staff, the grad, and the full-time staff review that. And this is one of the slides from one of our presentations that we had for our 2019 year. And so you'll see here that the question was, how satisfied were you to the degree which clear expectations were established regarding the following aspects of your position. This RA was able to, or this hall director showed that in 2018, they scored a 6 on the 1, 5.8, 5.4, 6.18, and 5.82. And then after 1 year in the position, they made some intentional changes regarding these 6 categories, or 5 categories, I'm sorry. And then they were able to see some pretty significant growth. And so some of those scores grew by over a point. Which to do that when you're analyzing data and means and things like that is pretty significant. So our head staff can make a plan, and then if they stay in that building for 2 years, or even if they just stay at the institution long enough to be at our next round of presentations, can see if the work that they put into that staff culture influenced the RA staff assessment of the department. So that's a great way to do it. The other side of using the data is what I talked about a little bit earlier, is when you use them as the service provider. So what are the students saying about the services that the RA is providing? And so this building specifically, yellow for us just means it was between 6 and 6.5. And then 6.5 to 7 is in green. And so this individual building looked at the overall scores for the staff. And some people would kill to have a 6.3 or a 6.5, but our goal is to always move the needle and go higher. And so, in 2018, we got a 6.2 for availabilities. So what can we do with the RA staff and help them see, like, you got a 6.2, are there things you can do? Is it a where am I board? Is it being more, clearly communicating with your staff? Is it making group me available to our residents so that they don't feel like they're ever really disconnected, even if you're not in the building? Are we putting signs up on the door that says, hey, if I'm not here, go to the front desk, so they feel like there's never a downtime where they can't get a question answered? And the head staff and the grad and the RAs can sit there and brainstorm what they want to do for this year to move the needle on that. So you can see in this building, specifically from 2018 to 2019, we saw significant growth based on their plan. So they obviously had some good ideas and were able to make that happen for the residents, which is really important. So one example I talk about was when I just started at Tennessee in 2015. One of the things about me that most people don't know is that I'm a secret shopper / mystery shopper is my hobby. And so I came here and I wasn't super satisfied with the service I was seeing provided at the front desk within my area, which is 5 residence halls, 3,000 students, predominantly first-year students. And so what I did is I put in a secret shopper program where we just had residents that would volunteer to go up to the front desk and either have a normal interaction or, try to get a lockout card without an ID on them or something like that. They'd fill out a quick 5-question survey and turn it into the head staff. And every staff member in my area for that semester got evaluated. And I've got 64 RAs in my area that year. We probably had a total of about 50 OAs maybe. I think there were 6 people that really got dinged for not providing good customer service. And so what did we do then? We followed up with them before their evaluation meeting. It was just a quick check-in to be like, hey, you were shopped, is what we call it. This is the results. Keep up the good work. And we love to do it between 12 and 8 because that's when the head staff aren't there in their offices. The staff works largely unsupervised. And so what are we learning from when we're not there physically to put our eyes on the situation? You can learn from a secret shopper program. And then from there, I asked if we could implement customer service training for the entire department, because ultimately I realized that we always talk about customer service, but if you don't define it and you have student staff members that have maybe never had a job providing a service before, they don't know what to do. And so to this day, we provide customer service training to our full-time staff, our grad staff, our RAs, and our OAs. Which totally combines over 350 staff members that every year get annual customer service training. And that's one example of how we took Sky Factor data and turned it into action to ultimately improve the front desk services score that comes out of our annual report. So it's just one way to take data and apply it to make meaningful change.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. I can see the secret shopper idea is very popular, and you might need to send out your evaluation as part of our presentation now.
I can do that.
Thanks. So as we mentioned earlier, and as Steve just alluded to, it's important to look at your past data to figure out what adjustments you need to make moving forward. So we can go on the next slide, Matt, but how do you use your past experiences to inform moving forward? Here on the slide, you'll see a couple examples of where you could use past information to tell you a little bit more about your staff team and your methods for hiring. So as I said earlier, the RA journey starts at the point of recruitment. When you're recruiting people, are you recruiting an inclusive and representative pool, or are you getting a certain subset that then results in higher scores or different processes? So we really want to look at that past information to inform what you're doing moving forward. With a system like eRez, obviously you can collect the data using from the point of recruitment all the way up to your offers. And when you're looking at the data and the other factors that play into your RA success, I want you to think back to those 4 traits that we identified earlier: the sense of accountability, the consistency in action, the ability to connect to others, and the desire to improve. So where can you access other resources that might help you inform your process moving forward? So, you know, did you have mid-year hires? And if you did, why did people leave? What were your candidate pool numbers like? What did your performance reviews say? And did they reflect the traits that are important in your institution? What did your exit interview and staff feedback say about your professional development and your recruitment? And then looking at, as Steve said, the previous teams of both new and returning staff members and how many returners wanted to come back, because that also shows you a little bit more about your success. So Steve talked a little bit about using Sky Factor data to showcase how residents perceive their RA. He talked about the ways that UTK has identified traits that they believe make a successful RA. So once you've determined what traits you believe make a successful RA, I encourage you to think about how you articulate those values throughout your recruitment and selection process, as well as your performance management throughout the year. So how do your professional staff role model the commitment to your valued traits and work to develop those traits? Where and how are you recruiting students, and how are you assessing their application and interview? It's important to assess based on what matters most to you and your institution, and also thinking about what traits are trainable and what are more of those innate traits that you just need people to have. In my role at eRezLife, I have the opportunity to talk to a lot of institutions about their staff selection process, as our software kind of, as I mentioned, sees the process through. And when discussing score sheets, reference checks, and feedback, I always ask, what do you value in your staff? Because it's surprising to see how many people value things like consistency, loyalty, drive, those kind of things in individuals, yet those qualities don't align with the questions that you're asking in interviews or your evaluation of their application form. So why not ask references to share an example of a time when an application showed a desire to improve? That likely will give you a more fruitful answer than asking something like the top 3 strengths of that applicant. And then if you jump ahead to decision day, how do you rank each candidate on the traits you value to ensure balanced teams? So here's a fun story. Prior to my work at eRezLife, I worked at the University of British Columbia, and I had a staff team of 50 student staff members. And one year, my second year, I decided I was going to hire a team almost all comprised of fun people, because I'm a fun person. But what I quickly realized that in hiring a homogeneous group, I failed not only the staff team, but the students that we work with. And the need to, we need to value that connection to others. And that's really the only piece of the traits that I was valuing, was these people would easily connect to others. But what I didn't value and what I underestimated is that staff learn a lot from each other. So while we expect that we'll be able to impart a lot of knowledge onto our staff teams, We need to look at the proficiency of the traits that we value and make sure that we take an asset-based approach to hiring to create an environment where RAs can both learn from our peers as much, learn from their peers as much as they learn from the professional staff members. So again, using data and assessment can help you with those things. And making sure that you're using all of the different iterations of your data and processes and staff management can really help you out with that. So moving forward, I encourage you to think about a couple things. So number one, how can data improve your process? So that can be your process of staff management. It can be your process of continual development of your staff. It can be your hiring and selection process. How can you involve current and past staff in the process? So again, using that feedback and past data. What are your key indicators of success? And as Steve said, making people aware of those key indicators can be a huge asset so that they're aware of where they need to put that energy in. And how will you assess RA satisfaction? So is that using the Sky Factor analysis? Is that by using some forms in your software service, or is that through other means? But really thinking about these key things to enable a process that is both beneficial to your institution as well as the professional development of your RAs. And with that, I think that's pretty much the conclusion of our presentation. We do have a couple kind of supplementary resources if you're interested. There is an article published in the Talking Stick in July on building and finding a better RA, where Matt and I were able to share some of the data from this presentation in more of a written form. We also have a webinar on storytelling, so the ability to tell your story of your data and what you're doing at your institution. And then Sky Factor also has a research note on how RA interactions and how they relate to resident satisfaction. So with that, we do have 5 more minutes for questions if anybody has more questions. And I also encourage you, Dylan has posted the evaluation in the chat. So if you could take a moment to fill that out. Lastly, we do have our contact information up here if anyone wants to be in touch. And I will just highlight that if you do want more information about Sky Factor, you can visit the link that Matt has included in the presentation there. If you're interested in anything to do with eRezLife, please feel free to reach out via our website. And if you want to connect with Steve, his contact information is there as well. So we'll give the last couple minutes for questions, and I'll also pass it over to Matt and Steve with any final thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. First of all, apologies with the craziness with the slides. At some point, my chat, when I tried to type, decided that it was going to try to control the slides while I was typing text. So that was the craziness at the end. The link to get more info is actually a landing page with resources from SEAHO, so it has the slide decks up there. The only reason there's a form there is A, we're going to email you the slides afterwards if you want it. And that's all we use that email for, unless you tell us you want us to email you. So that's all that is. So it's not going to be used for sales or anything unless you tell us you want us to, because that's the last thing we want to do. Madeline's question that just came in, any variation in data using curricular versus programming engagement models? We haven't looked at that yet. We just started collecting in the institutional profile for resident. If campuses do have a curricular model, we haven't had enough fill it out yet to be able to do some meaningful analysis on the data, but we are doing our best to try to collect that to get at that and other sorts of questions that you would want to know based on what sort of programming model campuses have.
One of the things I'll add real quick, anytime I think we use data, it needs to be about the data, but maybe not always about the data. And I think what that comes down to is we still need to use some common sense or discretion when it comes to giving staff feedback on their scores. You know, one of the things that my RA staffs in my area, our campus and our hall directors will tell you is that the timing of the assessment often they think reflects the survey. And so, you know, if you've had one floor that maybe recently had a significant amount of documentations or vandalism or things like that happen, you may see, if we give them a floor meeting the next week and ask them about the safety on campus or the maintenance and things like that, they're going to look at their immediate surroundings and may not summarize the entire academic year into their feedback. And so you do need to look at some of the things like that. But by and large, we've seen year after year after year that the data is pretty good at generally reflecting what was happening in that community. So the RA may quickly try and tell you like, well, we gave this out the week that I documented 20 of my residents for alcohol. And yes, that may have influenced one of the questions, but it did not likely influence every question that they answered. So data is important, but I think we still need to make sure we maintain some level of common sense to control for variables there.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point, Steve, that well, and even when we think about like the national data and trends, every campus is a little bit different. So there may be some, like your campus may look different. You may have, like I know Savannah's question earlier about upperclassmen and those living in apartments, how we work with those residents and how we empower and train our RAs to work with upperclassmen in apartment buildings. Some of the there's some different contexts there. So it's important that we look at the data, we use it, we reflect on it, but also recognize that there may be places that things may look a little different. And we, as Steve said, may need to use common sense and best judgment in how we apply that. That is not the end all be all, that we need to think about our context and the other things that play into that.